Dennis, floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Everybody understand me enough, but if I need to slow down, just flag it. Slow down. My talk is entitled Playing Ball with Others. I'm going to be talking about writing code in large community projects and writing quality code. I could also borrow a much longer title that someone wrote online, How to Develop Non-Trivial Computer Programs, which potentially must be programmed by several people, which must last for a substantial period of time and be maintained later and revised by others, which must be continually explainable at varying levels of detail to a variety of people with a variety of backgrounds by other people. It's very long, but it illustrates the point that when we're working on projects together, like WordPress, we're interacting with a lot of people, and the project lives on far beyond our contributions. Kind of like the opening question then is from one of my favorite books on programming from Microsoft Press, like, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. How buggy would your programs be if your compiler or if your runtime could point out every possible bug, every possible problem that could come with your code? Would you write bug-free software? Would you write bug-free plugins? The point being is, I think I would challenge that almost all of the bugs that we face on a regular basis could be prevented by being careful with how we program. I just want to address four different topics, or 4 different areas where we can work to kind of, in our development method, prevent some of those things from being done. I'm going to start off with boundary conditions. A quote from one of the developers at Basecamp is that, once your code gets large enough, you don't have edge cases anymore. If a little piece of code, a little tiny bug only impacts 1% of your users, or 0.5% of your users, or 0.1% of your users, and you have 100 million users, then you've got thousands of people who are experiencing this bug all the time. When you contribute to something like WordPress, Linux, or any major community project, your code gets immediately pushed out there to all these users. You get the good users, you get the bad users, the malicious users. Your code is being worked on by people without much experience, new programmers, old programmers who never learned, and also by really heavily used websites. So your code, regardless of how you develop it, is going to be deployed in situations where you didn't anticipate it. And we get these boundary conditions. This is a picture of finite element analysis of the stress of a point contact on a solid surface. And all the pattern that we see there is entirely dependent on this single point, this single boundary condition. I think it's a good illustration for our code because sometimes that one little tiny bug that, let's go ahead and ship it because it's not going to make much of a difference. That can account for all the behavior that our users or our customers see. And frankly, developing software without considering these cases, as rare as it may be, is kind of like developing a jet airliner without thinking about takeoff and landing. It spends most of its time cruising. So these are just some common boundary conditions we should always have in our head. I was taught early on in programming, whenever you make a function, imagine what would happen if nothing came into it or if everything came into it. Nothing. Things like, what happens if someone passes a null value to your parameters when you expect something else? What happens if they pass 0? What happens if you expect 0 and you get null, or the other way around? What happens if you're in a loop and something goes over int max? Suddenly you start the loop at the beginning and everything goes forever. What happens if your disk space is empty? Things that we should always be asking ourselves. For example, how does this matter? If the disk space is empty, we've got errors. PHP session start will fail if there's no disk space. Suddenly you can't store your session values. Let's think about version dependencies. What version of PHP are your users or the developers that are using your code going to be running? PHP introduced these things, which I love, the short array syntax, but that came in PHP 5.3, which is relatively new compared to what's running out there on millions of servers. So if you write a plugin that uses these because it looks great, it's clean and simple, now you're going to have tons of problems with people who are trying to use the plugin, and they have no idea why. And it's because their host didn't upgrade their PHP platform. The same thing with anonymous functions. I'm sorry, the anonymous functions are 5.3. The short array syntax is even newer, PHP 5.4. And also, statement terminators. What happens if someone writes in an SQL injection? What happens if they write in improper characters? They're trying to kind of take hold of what you were attempting to do and change it. Going on the zero and the null idea here, boundary conditions occur when you depend on PHP's equivalents. Zero, an empty string, an empty array, null, all these things, the string false, I think, I'm not sure now. All these things equate to the same value if we use a double equals operator. If we use a triple equals operator, it checks type as well, so we can properly handle those. In the case of everything happening at once, I want to provide an example of something also to look out for if you're writing anything with client and server communication. I think it might be common. It happened to me, and I found someone else on a major web service that it happened to as well. Failover catastrophes. What happens when your server starts slowing down and your clients are trying to retry the default situation? A server is heavy loaded, it's a little bit slower. It's too slow and times out on a request, and the client gets that back and says, oh, something happened, I'm going to try again. It sends another request, goes back into the server's already loaded, the server gets even more requests, slows down even more clients start failing, and this cascades into a denial of service, distributed denial of service that you created because your clients are just stuck in the dumb retry loop. Things like these, we can use tools. If we think about that when we put it in, we think, okay, retrying is good, but I don't want to overload the server by sending everything to it. I'll just back off. I'll try retrying once. If that doesn't work, I'll wait twice as long and retry a second time. Maybe I'll wait even twice as long then for a third time and then just give up if it doesn't work. In 1997, sometime in the Windows NT days, the US Navy was deploying the first generation of smart ships. And the USS Yorktown had, I think, like 14 Windows NT machines networked together on board that controlled the fuel pumps, the gauges, the ship communications. And some sailor, when entering in some values into the computer, put a 0. The software didn't anticipate getting a 0. It divided by 0, and it took the USS Yorktown completely out of commission. It's not sure how long, there's conflicting reports, but it was at least completely unserviceable for a few hours and maybe had to be towed back into its port. Later on in reflection, one of the engineers who worked on the project wrote this quote, and it's something we should all remember about community projects. We put stuff in there. We got to be able to maintain it. In the case with the Yorktown, it was input validation, it was an unexpected edge case. The failure was so critical that it brought everything down. So like when we're working with things, when we're developing a plugin, we're working in WordPress core, we always gotta think about what we're putting in there. Can it be maintained? Can the failure modes be sustainable, or would a failure in this part be totally catastrophic? Gives us into validating our input of the things that we can control and the things we can't control. Input is something we have no control over when we're writing code. We can control what we do with the code we write. We can control what we spit out to others. What others give to us, this is something we really don't have any way to force. We can only ask people to be nice. So, just some examples here. Anybody used this plugin before? This is a security plugin, but it had an injection vector that made your site completely vulnerable. They actually sanitized the input, but by typing in the right code in the URL, you could overwrite your database. They didn't completely validate their input. So the first kind of principle here is assume that all your input that you're getting is armed and dangerous. Anybody know where the problem is here?
He's speaking.
I'm sorry?
He's speaking.
Yeah, exactly. This is like a very primitive example. I hope none of you do this, but this is a variable supposedly from user input that goes right into the SQL stream. There's several other problems with the statement, but little Bobby tables can show up and totally trash our database. Somebody names their kid this, and then when it goes in there, it terminates early, creates a new SQL statement, and moves on. There's actually a really good way to get around this, and it's called parameter binding. And WordPress has it built in this prepare statement. With prepare, when we write an SQL query, we use a placeholder instead of the actual data. %s for strings, %ds for numbers, maybe %f if you have a floating point number. That's it. There's no quotes that you need. There's no brackets, no other escaping. All you do is pass in the parameter or the placeholder, and then you pass the variable into this prepare function, and it will handle it appropriately. And what it does is it tells MySQL, here's the first parameter, and then it will send that data in a separate stream so that it doesn't accidentally inject it. The other problem with that previous code here is that we don't do any validation on my user. What happens if there's no user that exists in the database? Well, when we try and run our second query, it's going to get messed up. This ID will be null, and it'll be a malformed SQL query, and it'll crash and give us an error. Again, so we want to validate that. Going further, if you're doing updates, inserts, replaces, or deletes from your database, WordPress is a great example. It has wonderful tools for these. The update command. You give it a table, you give it the updated fields, you give it where clause in the form of an array. These kind of things really help prevent you from making bugs, because that's a lot easier for me as some other developer reviewing your code to look over and see what you're doing in it. And as I'm writing that code, I don't have to worry about accidentally writing the query wrong. It's all verbose. It's not as pretty, but it's safer. The next principle is you should assume that people are going to be using your software in a way that they figure out that works for them, not necessarily the way that you intended it to work in the correct way. You could call it lazy programming, but we kind of grab the first thing that's available, and if it works, we go with it. This is an example of a function. The contents here I actually pulled out of WordPress core, where people have obviously passed various forms of the input, and this function is looking for blog. Is it an actual blog object? Do they already grab the blog out of the database? Is it an ID that refers to the blog? Did they pass nothing? This function accepts a null value, it accepts an object, it accepts an integer, and it accepts something else that might not work. You don't really know. This function allows people to be lazy like that. And when you assume that people are going to choose the thing that works and not the thing that's right, rewrite your functions in ways that force users or other developers to use your code in the intended way. If we were to rewrite this function to only accept a blog ID, then when we're working inside the function, we don't have to worry about what they sent us, and we don't have to worry about weird cases when they send the right data in the wrong form, like we sent it as an array instead of an object or a standard class or whatnot. write your function so that they can only be passed the correct information. And if you force that, even though it sounds a little offensive, if you force that on people, it'll prevent other people from misusing your code. Let's go ahead and add PHP doc syntax comments up here. Param, int, blog ID. PHP is obviously not statically typed and doesn't enforce typing. However, a lot of development environments will use these hints, these type hints from things like PHP doc comments, and will warn you or tell you what's expected. It makes the job of programming with other people's code a whole lot easier. You know, this previous function, I could actually pass in the string 123 foo, and it would think I passed in the number 123. It would work, and that's obviously wrong, and that can lead to bugs, especially later on. So let's be explicit, get things in the right type. I like two things. I like to always validate the input quality. Is it the right type of data? Does it follow the right structure? And is it the right quantity? Is the range correct? Notice in this case, I don't just check if the blog ID is a number, but a negative blog ID is invalid input. If we ever get that, we should fail. I want to check the range of other things too. If it's a string, can I accept an empty string? If I can't, so I want to check number one, string input, and does it have a length? This one is just another illustration about making assumptions. Does anybody know where the bug is in here? What we're trying to do is determine if a blog is a publicly accessible blog, then spit the output. The bug is the fact that this statement right here fails our assumptions in the multi-user sites where the blog has been deleted. A blog on a multi-user or on a multi-site installation can be deleted, can be archived, can be marked as spam. I didn't know that because I didn't look into what that blog status actually meant. But the proper way to check it is like this, which again is more code that looks ugly, but it's correct, and it's going to prevent us showing sensitive information to someone who shouldn't get it. For example, if something is marked as spam, we don't want to show it to the users. The point being is that we just want to make sure that we don't make assumptions about what we're getting. Finally, look out for gremlins in your input. These are things that appear to be there even though they shouldn't be. It's impossible that they're there. I'm going to introduce the concept of dual algorithms, something from that book. The idea is when you have something that's not working right, or is tricky, or is risky, or is some clever function that somebody wrote, provide a second way of doing the same thing and make sure that they both work. Provide a less risky counterpart. Here's an example. This is really innovative. This is a great function that some expert PHP guru made up. And it's designed to make our server process fast. I see blank looks, but this is valid PHP here, right? It spits out hello world. As a new programmer on the team, I have no idea what that does. When something breaks and Joe Schmo is gone, I have no idea how to fix his code. I don't even know what his code is supposed to do. Now this is an extreme, but how often do we come across the ninja programmer type who writes some really, really cool, really creative, really innovative thing that's very impossible for other people to understand. It's not documented well and whatnot. So if you're going to do something like this, and there's times where these are appropriate, especially in performance critical or security critical applications, then provide some hinting for the other developers. In a debug environment, go ahead and calculate the same value using a slow function or a less risky function. And then check. If they don't match, just fail. You can fail on a developer and out to production and they have a debug flag set, you can't help that. That's, your code's not going to be the only problem you're dealing with. But if you do something like this, it allows you to have the same kind of advantages that some of these creative sneaks have without risking it. You can extend this approach beyond like sneaky things and use this for live testing. Obviously, if you're refactoring a big piece of code or if you're adding a new feature, you can't risk taking everybody else down. But sometimes you really need the extra testing. Maybe you need to measure the performance of your new code path. Maybe you need to look out for edge cases. So what you can do is run your code the same way it's always been done. But then, for a certain handful of users, you'll have to kind of look on your own numbers and see how many users you have, how frequently the server load is being hit. For every one of those, like maybe 1 in 1,000, go ahead and run your new way of doing things. Check their output and report if it's different. I did this on the notifications backend for WordPress.com. We have the REST API endpoint that got completely rebuilt, and we were doing a very different thing. And I was worried about just deploying it out there. I didn't want to mess everybody else, not only people within Automattic, but people in the community who are using the API. So what I did is I did this. 1 out of every 1,000, I think on WordPress.com it was only maybe 1 out of every 10,000 users. I would run the old way and the new way, compare the results. And if they were different, I would send an email to myself that was limited to 1 an hour that would give me the debug information that I could use to go in. And the end result is I got this thing deployed and got all these edge cases figured out, all this testing done without any human intervention, without anybody really being affected by it, without causing any additional server load. Sure, 1 out of every 1,000 page loads is going to be a little bit slower for some user out there. But 1 out of 1,000, it's hardly noticeable. This section is probably just a reminder for us all, but comments in code are there for the things that aren't there in the code. So you should never see a comment like add X to Y. That's useless. It doesn't help anyone. It just gets in the way. What does help is documenting stuff that isn't obvious in the code. We want to provide the hints to a later reader, which could be yourself, by the way, if you come back to your code a year later and you don't remember what the heck you were doing. The bits of information that you need to understand the picture as a whole. An example here, how it could have been. Describing code, maybe an obvious way of doing this, or something that seems like an obvious way of doing something that you didn't do, and there's a reason for it. In this case, I didn't want someone to come in at a later point in time and say, oh, why in the heck did he add all this code here? Let's just take it out, let's just see if pure red magic is false. They could do that and it would probably work some of the time, but I did this for a reason. The reason is, if we just check if it's false, we're going to flag a warning. A warning could get out to a user or could break a unit test. So I say, hey look, if you come across here and you think what I'm doing is stupid, remember that there's a reason I did it that way. I read someone who wrote that one of his things that he does is he puts a paper up on his monitor, a sticker that says, the people that I work with are not bozos. A lot of times when we come across code that we want to change, there's a reason why it's the way it is. I also want to describe any abnormalities. In this code, I'm making a database request, and I only need so many, maybe 20, but instead I grab all of the rows, matching the query. Well, why do I do that? Someone might come in later and say, oh look, this is kind of dumb, let's go and change that and we'll make our application faster. But actually it's an abnormality. There's a reason I do it this way, because in this particular case, we might, 10% of the time we'll get rid of 1 or 2 of those, and then we won't have enough rows to send back to the user. So we have to make the second database call, and that's really performance heavy. It costs a lot. So instead, let's just grab it all and let PHP do the work. It'll be much faster. Anything that, when you're programming, you think, oh, there's a catch here. Comment it. It'll help yourself later on, it'll help others. And also, obviously, we want to point out any risks in your comments. If your function does something that's risky, if there are certain conditions where your code is going to fail, if you're writing a plugin and it's known not to work with a certain other plugin or something like that, this should be documented. It can be documented in the code, it can be documented in the documentation. We should write out any place there's risk, because inevitably somebody else is going to be called when this problem comes up. It's your code, you might know where the bug is, you might know how to get it, but you're not the one who's going to be called because nobody else knows. So they're going to call Barry in New Zealand, and he's going to start reading through the code. And if you've done your job properly, he's going to get to this spot and say, oh my gosh, this is what's causing it. He'll be able to fix it. I like to say, if you have to pause to think about it, it's not obvious. If you have to pause when you're writing it, throw it in there. I don't know what this means. If I'm reading through code and I come across that, I'm going to have to open up php.net in my browser, I'm going to have to go search for it and read about it. But just a one little quickie. You know, comments are gray in your development environments for a reason. Like they're just kind of, they're there, but they don't stand out. But a nice little hint goes a long way. Things like putting comments on expected inputs. You know, in this function, the comment's unnecessary really because I'm doing the code. The comment doesn't even explain the code. But if someone comes along here and they're wondering why is this happening? Well, just a quick little comment that says, look, this is the string I expect, and here's what I'm doing to it. Algorithmic processes, the whys, the things that aren't there. And of course, you know, kind of moving on to other habits here in the world of Python, explicit is better than implicit. Anybody remember this? This is a snippet from Apple's SSL code. Because of this right here, their SSL validation failed and would actually say certificate was valid without ever checking it. Could have been prevented by putting in some curly brackets and seeing that that was out of place. This isn't a long string of if statements that all go to fail. You know, PHP allows us to write an if statement with a single line with no curly brackets. And when you read this, it looks like these are both part of the if statement, but they're not. Every time this runs, if the if statement is true, it'll fail and go on, and we're fine. But if everything is normal, if the SSL certificate is, or if this part of the process is valid, it's going to skip that go-to, and then the next line of code it executes is this go-to. So we've made an unconditional branch. I like to recommend people use curly brackets always with PHP or JavaScript or whatever. When you're working with debuggers, debuggers like to put a line number on things. They like to separate things out. Other development tools really depend on those for parsing properly. Finally, I want to make some points about our output. I was taught in learning how to drive for every in, have an out. Meaning before I jump into something, have a plan for how I might have to get out if I need to. The Go language kind of learned this lesson and applied it to programming. They force you to deal with output, and they force you to be explicit about it. Every function should have to return a legitimate value. If you write something that can return an invalid response, rethink the way you're doing it. This is WordPress for insert post. It either returns a post ID, or a 0, or a WP error class. And that depends on this flag, which is defaulted to false. So if you're reading code and you come across this statement, what is it going to return? Do you know what true means there? Maybe you think it's normal and you just move on, or maybe you take the time to look it up in the documentation and figure that out. But even in this case, if something happens, you're not getting a post ID back. You expect an integer post ID. What you get is a WP error class. It's an invalid output. So if you run into these cases, rewrite it. There's the C way of doing things where you store an error for later, and second function. This is a bad example with insert post because no one wants that. But there's a lot of cases where we use some input parameter to control the way a function behaves. That leads to confusing code paths and it leads to confusing developers. Just make a second function. Another way you could do it is, if you have some things like this, have some kind of global manager that controls the behavior of the program in general. That way, when you're developing, everything will be consistent. And finally, indicate the success of your functions. A lot of times, you see things like this. Here, it just returns. I think it returns null, but I think I'd better go to php.net and check and make sure that's what actually happens. Or, if it's successful, it actually returns a legitimate query result. We can rewrite functions like this so that they only return a success value or only return a legitimate value. But mixing them together is weird because we kind of have to know a lot more about whether the function succeeded or failed than just yes or no. I'll finish with a few freebies. Don't be cute. Don't show off when you're working with a big project by making these complicated spaghetti messes that are creative and innovative. It's not the place for it. It's great, but don't do it there. Be consistent. You don't necessarily have to follow the style guide of the project you're in. It's a good thing to do, but if you have variations, stick with your variations. Be internally consistent. It'll help somebody who's reading your code later on. Remember the tools: debuggers, performance analyzers, static typing or static tools, linkers. These things have different requirements and are something developers are always using. Don't mess up someone else's development path by using a shortcut in your code that you prefer. And lastly, use an IDE. If you like Vim, which I love Vim, use a good extension. Use syntax highlighting, use C-scoping, use these different tools because it saves you time. And I use PHP Storm. PHP Storm does wonderful things for information gathering. It'll let me jump to a function, find where a function is called, and show me type increment. The more quickly the information that you need is available, then the less likely you are to make a mistake and introduce a bug or let somebody else use your coding properly.
What tools do you use in your day-to-day work?
The tools that I use in my day-to-day work, I use PHP Storm heavily and WebStorm also for JavaScript work. That's the main tool. It's code inspection. It has some built-in error detection. I use Xdebug to do that. And again, PHP Storm is that inside. I do use Vim also, not a lot. I also use unit tests, PHP unit. If anybody else has not heard of PHP unit, it's a great framework for doing automated tests of your code. On the JavaScript side, I work in a Node and a React environment, so I use a whole couple of tools related to that. Some JS centers, grunt unit tests, front-based unit tests, and then my browser and online documentation.
Do you really use your new algorithms on live server? Isn't it slowing down the live website?
Is what slowing it down? Could you repeat?
Isn't testing algorithms on live server slowing down the website?
Are you referring to when we were doing this?
Yes.
The dual algorithms? Yeah. So it's a trade-off. What's more important? load on the server. It wasn't a lot. So it was worth it to me. In exchange for that additional load, I took care of bugs that would have affected thousands of users. I found one where a language setting was messing up translations. You don't want to offend somebody because WordPress works fine, your plugin works fine in Slovak or English, and it works completely in Russian. I found other bugs, so you're not writing this forever, but definitely there's value in kind of like choosing when it's appropriate. Running it as a test is like automated beta test.
I want to ask something more about what's the way you contribute to WordPress community? Do you use versioning systems like Git?
Yeah, I use Git and Subversion on a daily basis. I cry when I use Subversion, but that's that's what WordPress uses, and the repository is huge. So there's an existing workflow. It's not all that bad, but it just means a lot more going to command line tools to do things that are done automatically in Git.
Thank you.
Hi, you had some bad code examples in your presentation. So what do you regularly do when you work on something and you come across a code that you notice it's bad in some way? What do you do?
That was a good question. What do we do when we find bad code? We have to use our judgment, right? We have tasks that we have to accomplish, and we have tasks we would like to accomplish. I like to do risk assessment, and as programmers, we can do a fairly good job of assessing how risky we think a certain piece of code is. If I come across a piece of code and it looks like it's bad, but it's not too bad, this goes back to that thing on the USS Yorktown. How critical is your failure mode? If it's not going to cause a whole lot of trouble, I'll put it on my to-do list at the bottom, and if I get time to come back to it, I will. If I see something and I'm just like, oh my goodness, this could crash in terrible ways and people could die in a fire, then I'll put it on my priority list accordingly. Other things, like with WordPress, it's very challenging because, again, we've got hundreds of millions of websites that run on WordPress. We've got, hundreds of thousands of plugins that are all intertwined, and this is where the large community project part of it comes in. We've got to be very careful with making changes. On insert post, I didn't investigate the history there, but I assume that it started, I'm referring to where it accepted all the different inputs. I assume that it started out simple, and over time it kind of grew and grew and grew because we never forced people to do it. Well, now we're stuck. I don't like the way this looks, but there's no way you can change it. At best, when we come to a situation like this, what we can do is we can create a new function. I've done this before. Create a new function to do just what you want it to do in the right way. And moving forward, try and move existing code to use your new function. And eventually, there'll be a point in time when you can safely say, anybody who is still calling this old function is either there's no one there or it's acceptable. And they'll just have to change. It's an old plugin that hasn't been touched in 5 years. Nobody's using it. At some point you draw the line. But it's all about assessing that risk.
Please, can you go back to that code with that no number?
The hello world?
No.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Can you please describe how did this piece of code end in the live production? This was on WordPress.com, or where did you push this?
So when I did this, personally, I was working in the REST API, which gets called anytime you load a WordPress.com site, and if you're running Jetpack with the notifications module, it was being called. So I don't remember exactly, but just unbelievable. Hundreds of thousands of users at the same point in time. I ran it this way. And I was doing a fairly heavy operation. I was doing database calls in 2 different ways. I was generating notifications in 2 different ways. An old system that seemed slow, a new system that I was working on that seemed fast. So all in all, I ended up almost doubling the load time for some people. But on the other hand, load time was, I think at the time it was around 200 to 500 milliseconds, depending on the data that you were getting. So that went up to 700 to 1,000 milliseconds, which is kind of like a bad network connection. Like it just, to the user, it seemed like it was just taking a little bit longer than normal. And that particular user probably never had that happen to them again.
But did you push this to the deployment system or what kind of system did you use?
Yeah, it was deployed live for a while because we don't have a good way to do live testing otherwise. So the code lived right next to each other. I had a callback function and I had a new callback function. And basically inside of the callback function, I did this random check, and of course internally all of us at Automattic were running the new code. It just said if this random test meets, and this is simpler than what I did, but it illustrates the point you made. Then it would go ahead and run both, and it would only ever spit out the old way of doing things to the user. The user was never impacted by any of these bugs that I discovered. And additionally, through using our stats tracking and metrics, I was able to evaluate the performance comparison of these 2 functions. So before I ever deployed, I was able to know, okay, this is what % of a reduction in our server load should occur when we push this out to everyone.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we have time for one last question. Or have some more coffee time. Oh, yeah.
How much is WordPress scalable? To what project, for what project you can use WordPress?
Wow, to what extent can someone use WordPress? WordPress isn't really in the limiting possibilities. Who here has developed a plugin or a theme? Okay, so this is me going through a lot of things. This is great. WordPress does a few things really, really well. It does user authentication. It does content management. It does filtering. It does database interaction. Really well. On top of that, it's fully extensible. So you can do anything that you want to do with it. The real question when working with WordPress is not what can it do, but more what do you want to do with it. It's simple enough that someone can install it in 5 minutes on their server and get a home website set up. It's also stable enough that to use WordPress.com, for example, which we run WordPress like everybody else does, we have, I don't know, a couple 100 million users. We've got a massively scaled database system to support all this, and it's very, very fast. I think you'll be hard-pressed to find a WordPress most faster than WordPress.com because we have our own plugins, and there's nothing magical about what we do. We've made our own extensions to WordPress to handle that. There are some newspapers that have modified WordPress through plugins and themes to do their layout, their editing, their procurement, everything inside of WordPress. They gave it a new interface. And here's the really cool thing. As we deploy the REST API that's coming out, which you can currently use if you have a Jetpack plugin or if you have a WordPress.com site, you can decouple everything from PHP. You can build a JavaScript website that uses WordPress, that pulls in your posts from WordPress now, from your WordPress server. do all this stuff. And there's an absolutely fantastic presentation by Jack Lennox from WordCamp London just a few weeks ago, where he illustrates what kind of possibilities there are with making a REST API-based game.
Is it possible to deploy database as master and slave in WordPress?
WordPress is built on MySQL, so it's possible to work in different configurations. It requires a lot of work. So the standard WordPress is just a MySQL connection. Long ago, I'm ashamed to say it, but I actually hooked up a MySQL website on I2S with SQL Server. It's possible. It's not pretty. If you're doing things within MySQL, it should work.
Alright, so thank you very much for coming.